In the early 1990s, there was no child on earth more famous than Macaulay Culkin. His face was everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, television commercials, talk shows. Even families who rarely went to the theater knew exactly who he was. With one performance in Home Alone, Macaulay became more than just a child actor. He became a cultural phenomenon. To the outside world, his life looked magical. He was rich, adored, successful, and living what millions of children dreamed about. Adults laughed at his jokes. Directors praised his talent. Fans treated him like the golden child of Hollywood. At only 10 years old, he had already achieved more fame than most actors spend an entire lifetime chasing. But behind that smile was a child slowly being consumed by a machine far bigger than himself. And the tragic truth is that almost nobody noticed it at the time. Long before the fame, Macaulay's childhood was already complicated. He was born in New York City, into a large family struggling financially. His parents never married, and the household environment was often described as chaotic. Privacy barely existed. The family lived together in a small apartment while trying to survive from paycheck to paycheck. From an early age, performing became less of a hobby and more of an opportunity for survival. Macaulay showed natural talent almost immediately. He had charisma cameras loved. Unlike many child actors who seemed rehearsed or artificial, he felt authentic. Audiences connected with him instantly because he came across as funny, vulnerable, and emotionally real. Hollywood noticed quickly. Small roles turned into bigger opportunities. Before long, casting directors realized this quiet little boy had something rare, the ability to completely dominate a screen without even trying. Producers believed they had found the next superstar. What nobody stopped to ask was whether a child should carry that level of pressure at all. Then came the movie that changed everything. When Home Alone premiered in 1990, it exploded beyond anyone's expectations. The film became one of the biggest comedy hits in cinematic history. Families watched it repeatedly during the holidays. Children copied Kevin McAllister's traps. Entire generations memorized the lines. And at the center of it all was Macaulay. Overnight, his life transformed into a non-stop cycle of filming, interviews, appearances, travel, and business deals. The world treated him less like a child and more like a product. Studio executives saw unlimited profit potential. Reporters wanted access to every detail of his personal life. Fans screamed his name everywhere he went. Imagine being 10 years old and realizing you can no longer walk through an airport without strangers surrounding you. That was his reality. The success of Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, pushed things even further. His salary skyrocketed. By the early 1990s, Macaulay had become one of the highest-paid child actors in entertainment history. Millions of dollars flowed around him before he was even old enough to fully understand money itself. But with fame came another problem: control. Many people who later worked with the family described Macaulay's father, Kit Culkin, as an aggressive and dominating figure behind the scenes. According to multiple reports over the years, Kit controlled nearly every aspect of his son's career. Directors allegedly feared him. Studio executives reportedly struggled dealing with him. Some insiders even claimed that working with Macaulay often meant enduring intense tension from his father throughout productions. For a child actor, this created a terrifying dynamic. Macaulay wasn't just responsible for his own success anymore. He had become the financial engine of an entire family. Every movie mattered. Every contract mattered. Every paycheck mattered. That kind of burden can crush adults. Now imagine carrying it as a little boy still trying to understand the world. As the money increased, the emotional pressure intensified. Films like My Girl showed that Macaulay could do more than comedy. Audiences were shocked by his emotional depth. His performance revealed vulnerability far beyond his years, especially during the film's heartbreaking ending. Ironically, the same sensitivity that made him such a compelling actor may have also made Hollywood more damaging for him emotionally. The industry wanted constant output. Another movie. Another interview. Another red carpet. Another performance. Childhood itself slowly disappeared. Most children spend their early years making mistakes privately, learning who they are away from public judgment. Macaulay never had that luxury. Every awkward stage of growing up happened under cameras. Every physical change became tabloid material. Every rumor spread worldwide instantly. And eventually the cracks started showing. Behind the scenes, tensions within the family reportedly became impossible to ignore. His parents' relationship deteriorated as Macaulay's fame grew larger. Arguments over money and control reportedly consumed the household. Instead of stability, success brought chaos. Then came one of the darkest moments of all. His parents entered a brutal custody battle that quickly became public spectacle. Newspapers covered intimate family details daily. Television programs discussed his fortune constantly. Adults debated who should control the millions he had earned through years of exhausting labor. Few people seemed concerned about what the child at the center of the storm actually felt. For Macaulay, the experience was devastating. Later in life, he would speak carefully about his childhood, often avoiding explicit details, but strongly implying emotional pain underneath the surface. Some interviews suggested he felt isolated for years. Others hinted that fame had robbed him of something fundamental he could never fully recover: trust, normalcy, safety. At the same time, audiences kept demanding more from him. Hollywood has always had a dangerous relationship with child stars. As long as they remain profitable, the industry protects them. But once they begin aging out of their cute image, the system often turns cold incredibly fast. And that transformation was already beginning for Macaulay before he even reached adulthood. People forget how unnatural child fame really is. Imagine being treated like the most important person in the room at age 11, only to suddenly feel discarded a few years later when studios move on to younger faces. That psychological crash destroys many former child stars. For Macaulay, it became impossible to separate his personal identity from public expectations. Millions of fans still saw him as Kevin McAllister. But inside, he was becoming a confused teenager carrying years of emotional exhaustion. And soon, he would make a decision that shocked Hollywood completely. At the height of his career, Macaulay Culkin walked away from it all. That question is what makes the story of Macaulay Culkin so heartbreaking even today. Because when people look back at his career now, many no longer see only the funny kid from Home Alone. They see a child carrying responsibilities no child should ever have been forced to carry. And the deeper fans looked into his life over the years, the clearer it became that fame had stolen something from him long before adulthood ever began. One of the saddest realities about child stardom is that the world often confuses success with happiness. Adults see money, applause, luxury, and attention, assuming those things automatically create fulfillment. But emotional security cannot be bought with movie contracts. In many ways, Macaulay's story exposed the dark machinery hidden behind Hollywood's obsession with young stars. The entertainment industry loves innocence. It profits from childhood charm. It builds billion-dollar franchises around youthful energy and vulnerability. But once those children grow older, the same system often abandons them emotionally. Macaulay experienced that transformation firsthand. During his years away from Hollywood, he reportedly struggled with trust issues and isolation. Fame had distorted nearly every relationship in his life from a young age. When people approach a child because of money or celebrity status, it becomes difficult to know who genuinely cares. Imagine growing up unable to fully trust the intentions of adults around you. That kind of emotional confusion leaves permanent scars. In later interviews, Macaulay occasionally hinted at how deeply complicated his childhood really was. He spoke about not wanting to repeat the mistakes of his upbringing. He described periods where he felt disconnected from the identity the world projected onto him. Sometimes his humor masked obvious emotional pain underneath. And perhaps that was part of his survival strategy. Humor. Many people who endure childhood trauma develop the ability to joke about painful experiences because directly confronting them feels too overwhelming. Fans often noticed that even when Macaulay discussed dark periods of his life, he did so with sarcasm or irony, almost as if he were trying to soften the emotional weight for himself. But behind the jokes was a painful truth. He had spent much of his life trying to escape a version of himself the world refused to let go. Even decades later, interviewers still primarily asked him about one movie, Home Alone. Not his growth. Not his healing. Not who he became as an adult. Always the same childhood image. That constant attachment to the past can become emotionally suffocating for former child stars. They are treated less like evolving human beings and more like nostalgic artifacts frozen in time for public comfort. For Macaulay, this likely created a strange emotional contradiction. The role that gave him worldwide love also trapped him inside an identity he never fully chose. And yet, despite everything, he survived what many others could not. That alone makes his story extraordinary. Throughout Hollywood history, countless child stars spiraled into addiction, isolation, financial ruin, or early death after fame overwhelmed them emotionally. The pressures are enormous. Public scrutiny, identity confusion, exploitation, loneliness, and constant judgment during formative years. Some never recover. Macaulay came dangerously close to becoming another tragedy people discussed after it was too late. There were years when the media seemed almost eager for his collapse. Every appearance became a headline. Every tired expression became proof of disaster. Certain tabloids portrayed him as permanently broken, as though recovery itself were impossible. But slowly, quietly, he proved them wrong. Instead of returning to Hollywood's high-pressure spotlight full-time, Macaulay rebuilt his life carefully and privately. He chose smaller projects. He embraced weird humor and independent creativity. He stopped trying to satisfy public expectations. Most importantly, he appeared to reclaim ownership over his own identity. That may sound simple. For someone raised inside a global celebrity machine, it is incredibly difficult. Then came fatherhood. When news broke that Macaulay and Brenda Song had welcomed children together, many longtime fans became unexpectedly emotional. People who had watched him grow up through decades of public pain suddenly saw something they never thought possible. Peace. Real peace. Observers noticed how protective and intentional he seemed about family life. Unlike the chaotic environment surrounding his own childhood, Macaulay appeared determined to create stability and emotional safety for his children. In some ways, that may have become his greatest redemption story. Not fame, not money, not a Hollywood comeback. Breaking the cycle. And maybe that is why his story still resonates so deeply with audiences today. Because beneath the celebrity headlines is something painfully human. A child trying to survive circumstances he never chose. People often forget that child actors cannot fully consent to fame in the way adults do. They are pushed into systems controlled by parents, studios, agents, executives, and audiences before their identities are fully formed. By the time they understand the consequences, their childhood may already be gone. That realization changes the way many people now view old interviews with Macaulay. When audiences rewatch clips of him smiling on talk shows at age 10 or 11, there's a different feeling now. Behind the jokes and charm, some viewers notice exhaustion in his eyes. Others see pressure. Some see loneliness hiding underneath performance instincts far too mature for a child. And suddenly, the laughter feels different. Because the truth is devastating. The little boy who made the world laugh was quietly struggling while millions watched. And perhaps the cruelest part of all is this. The world loved Macaulay Culkin as an icon long before it truly cared about him as a person. That realization becomes even more painful when you examine what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. For many child stars, adulthood brings freedom. For Macaulay Culkin, adulthood initially brought emptiness. Imagine spending your entire childhood being treated as one of the most important people in entertainment, only to wake up one day and realize the world has moved on. The applause disappears. The schedules vanish. The attention fades. And suddenly, you are left alone with years of emotional damage you never had time to process. That transition can psychologically destroy people. And in many ways, Macaulay seemed haunted not only by fame itself, but by the loss of childhood that fame created. While most adults remember growing up through ordinary milestones, school memories, private mistakes, friendships away from public scrutiny, his adolescence became part of global entertainment culture. There was no escape from public judgment. Even during periods when he intentionally withdrew from Hollywood, the media refused to leave him alone. Paparazzi still followed him. Gossip websites still tracked his appearance obsessively. Fans still expected him to remain emotionally connected to a role he played as a little boy. It became almost impossible for him to exist as a normal human being. One of the darkest aspects of his story was the way society seemed entertained by his suffering. During the 2000s, cruel jokes about his appearance spread constantly online. Photos of him looking exhausted or thin circulated with mocking captions. Instead of empathy, many people treated his struggles like internet content. And perhaps that says something disturbing about celebrity culture itself. Audiences often claim to love child stars, but what they truly love is the fantasy those stars provide. The moment reality becomes uncomfortable, aging, trauma, addiction rumors, emotional instability, society frequently turns against them. The same public that once celebrated Macaulay's innocence now consumed stories about his pain for entertainment. That emotional betrayal cuts deeply. Yet through all the chaos, there were subtle signs that he still possessed remarkable resilience. Even during difficult interviews, Macaulay retained intelligence, self-awareness, and sharp humor. Unlike many celebrities completely destroyed by fame, he still seemed capable of stepping outside the madness and recognizing how absurd Hollywood culture truly was. At times, he even mocked his own public image. But underneath the sarcasm was someone who had endured extraordinary emotional pressure since childhood. People close to former child stars often describe a phenomenon called frozen identity. Because the public becomes attached to a specific version of them at a young age, those celebrities sometimes struggle to evolve emotionally. No matter how much time passes, society continues treating them as children. Macaulay experienced this for decades. To millions of people, he would always be Kevin McAllister, clever, funny, mischievous, eternally young. But real life kept moving. He got older. He changed. He suffered. And perhaps the saddest part is that audiences were often uncomfortable acknowledging those realities because it shattered their nostalgic fantasy. There's also another painful truth many people overlook. Child stars are rarely allowed to fail privately. Most teenagers make mistakes away from headlines. They experiment with identity, relationships, appearance, and independence without global commentary. But when famous children stumble, the world watches everything in real time. Every bad decision becomes permanent public history. For Macaulay, that pressure likely intensified feelings of isolation. Mistakes that would have been minor for ordinary people became front-page stories for him. Personal struggles became public spectacle. Emotional pain became tabloid profit. And through it all, he kept retreating further from mainstream celebrity culture. Ironically, that withdrawal may have saved his life. Unlike many former stars desperate to remain relevant at any cost, Macaulay eventually stopped chasing public approval altogether. He embraced a quieter existence. He surrounded himself with people outside Hollywood's toxic machinery. He learned to laugh at fame instead of worshiping it. Over time, something remarkable happened. The sadness people once saw in him slowly began fading. Fans who watched his later interviews noticed genuine warmth returning to his personality. His eyes no longer carried the same exhaustion visible during darker periods of his life. He appeared more comfortable with himself, less like a haunted former child star, and more like someone finally discovering emotional stability. And perhaps no relationship symbolized that healing more than his life with Brenda Song. Unlike the chaotic celebrity pairings constantly dominating tabloids, their relationship seemed grounded and deeply private. Instead of chasing publicity, they built something quieter, more authentic, more human. For longtime fans, seeing Macaulay become a father felt almost surreal. Not because people doubted his ability to love, but because so many feared he would never fully recover from his own childhood wounds. Yet fatherhood appeared to change him profoundly. In interviews, he occasionally hinted at how seriously he took the responsibility. Observers noticed how protective he became regarding family privacy. It was as though he understood better than anyone how dangerous, uncontrolled fame could be for children. That awareness carried emotional weight. Because somewhere deep down, the little boy Hollywood failed was now trying to protect another generation from experiencing similar pain. And maybe that is the true tragedy of Macaulay Culkin. Not simply that fame hurt him, but that he had to spend much of his adult life recovering from a childhood the world insisted on calling dreamlike. People saw wealth. People saw success. People saw laughter. What they didn't see was the emotional cost hidden underneath the performance. The loneliness. The pressure. The loss of innocence. The constant feeling of being watched instead of understood. Today, when audiences revisit Home Alone during the holidays, many experience an unexpected sadness beneath the nostalgia. Because they now understand something they missed years ago. The child making everyone laugh on screen was carrying burdens no child should ever have to carry. And while the world celebrated the character, the real boy behind him was slowly disappearing. For years, that disappearance happened quietly. Not with one dramatic collapse. Not with one catastrophic scandal. But through thousands of small emotional wounds accumulating over time. That is what makes the story of Macaulay Culkin feel so devastating to many people today. Looking back, the warning signs were always there. The exhaustion in interviews. The uncomfortable family dynamics. The pressure placed on a child expected to carry massive financial success before even understanding adulthood. But during the peak of his fame, almost nobody wanted to acknowledge those realities. Because Hollywood was making too much money. Studios continued building projects around him. Television networks continued booking him. Reporters continued chasing access to him. Fans continued demanding more appearances, more movies, more entertainment. The machine never stopped moving long enough to ask whether the child at the center of it was emotionally surviving. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all is this. The very qualities that made Macaulay such a brilliant child actor may have also made him more emotionally vulnerable to Hollywood itself. He was unusually expressive, sensitive, observant, authentic. Audiences connected to him because he felt real. But children who feel emotions deeply often absorb pressure deeply too. As adults later revisited his career, many noticed something haunting about his performances. Even in comedic scenes, Macaulay often projected emotions with maturity far beyond his age. There was intelligence behind his eyes, awareness, vulnerability. What looked charming on screen may actually have reflected a child processing enormous emotional complexity internally. That realization changes how people watch his films now. Especially My Girl. The movie's emotional ending became iconic partly because Macaulay's performance felt painfully sincere. Audiences cried because they believed every emotion on his face. Looking back, some viewers wonder whether that depth came from experiences no child should have been carrying already. And sadly, his story was far from unique. Hollywood has a long and disturbing history of exploiting child performers while failing to protect them psychologically. Many former child stars later described feelings of isolation, manipulation, identity confusion, and emotional burnout. Some turned to addiction. Others disappeared entirely from public life. Some never survived adulthood at all. Macaulay came frighteningly close to becoming another cautionary tale. That is why his eventual recovery feels so emotionally significant to many fans. Against enormous odds, he slowly found a way to rebuild himself outside the machinery that once consumed him. But healing did not happen overnight. For a long time, the world continued defining him by his worst moments. The internet especially became brutal during the rise of celebrity gossip culture. Every unflattering photograph spread instantly. Every rumor became global discussion within hours. Some websites openly treated Macaulay's struggles like serialized entertainment. And because he had once represented childhood innocence for millions of people, audiences reacted to his decline with a strange mix of fascination and discomfort. People wanted the nostalgia, but they didn't want the reality behind it. The reality was that child fame had consequences. Real consequences. Emotional consequences. Psychological consequences. Human consequences. Eventually, however, something remarkable happened in public perception. As society became more aware of mental health discussions and the darker side of celebrity culture, many people began reevaluating how former child stars had been treated. Instead of mocking Macaulay, audiences started empathizing with him. For the first time in years, people stopped asking, "What went wrong with him?" and started asking, "What happened to him?" That shift matters, because it recognizes that many child stars are not inherently broken. They are often products of environments that place impossible expectations on developing minds. They are children turned into global commodities before fully understanding what fame costs emotionally. Macaulay's story became one of the clearest examples of that reality. And perhaps that is why his recent happiness feels surprisingly emotional for longtime fans. Seeing him smile genuinely in modern interviews carries weight because audiences remember periods when he looked deeply lost. People who grew up watching him feared they were witnessing another tragic ending unfold in slow motion. Instead, they witnessed survival. Not perfect recovery. Not a fairy tale Hollywood comeback. Something far more meaningful. Peace. There's a powerful moment many fans noticed during one of his later public appearances. The nervousness and sadness once visible in his demeanor seemed replaced by calm self-awareness. He joked comfortably. He looked emotionally present. He no longer appeared trapped by the expectations of childhood fame. For someone whose identity had been controlled by public perception for decades, that transformation felt enormous. And perhaps fatherhood completed that healing process in ways outsiders can barely understand. When Macaulay became a parent himself, many observers sensed deep emotional meaning behind it. Here was a man whose own childhood had been shaped by pressure, instability, and public exploitation, now creating a completely different environment for his own children. Privacy instead of exposure. Protection instead of pressure. Love instead of performance. That contrast says everything. Because sometimes the greatest victory trauma survivors achieve is not fame or wealth. It is refusing to repeat the cycle. Still, the sadness surrounding his story never fully disappears. Even now, people often revisit old interviews or photographs of young Macaulay Culkin and feel an ache they didn't feel years earlier. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a child entertain the world while unknowingly carrying emotional burdens too heavy for his age. The laughter sounds different now. The smile looks different now. And the movies themselves carry a strange emotional shadow once audiences understand what was happening behind the scenes. Because beneath the success story was a lonely little boy trying desperately to survive adulthood before he had even finished being a child. A boy the world adored. A boy Hollywood profited from. A boy millions watched grow up. But perhaps never truly saw. As the years passed, something unexpected began happening around Macaulay Culkin. The world slowly started feeling guilty. Not officially, not publicly, but emotionally. People who once laughed at tabloid headlines began looking back with discomfort. Fans who had shared memes about his appearance started realizing they had been mocking someone clearly struggling under the weight of extraordinary childhood trauma. Even entertainment journalists began revisiting the darker side of child stardom with a more critical eye. And at the center of those conversations was always Macaulay, because his story forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. How many child stars were destroyed while audiences applauded from a distance? The more people learned about Hollywood's treatment of young performers, the sadder his rise to fame appeared. Adults had built an empire around a child's personality. Studios earned fortunes from his image. Television networks profited from his charm. Magazines sold millions of copies featuring his face. But when emotional consequences emerged later, the same system largely disappeared. That abandonment leaves scars difficult to explain. Many former child actors describe feeling emotionally used up by adulthood. Their most valuable years were consumed by an industry obsessed with profit and attention. By the time they finally gained control over their own lives, exhaustion had already set in. For Macaulay, that exhaustion became visible for years. Even his body language often reflected it. In older interviews, there were moments when he seemed emotionally detached from conversations about his childhood fame, almost like he was discussing someone else entirely. Sometimes he smiled while describing painful experiences, which only made the sadness underneath more obvious. Trauma often works that way. People learn to mask pain because openly carrying it becomes too heavy. And perhaps no part of his story feels more heartbreaking than the simple fact that he never truly got to discover who he was away from public expectations. From the moment he became famous, the world projected identities onto him constantly. The funny kid, the millionaire child star, the troubled former actor, the cautionary tale, the comeback story. Everyone had a version of Macaulay Culkin in their minds. But very few people understood the actual human being living underneath those labels. That disconnect can become psychologically isolating. When millions feel emotionally connected to a public image of you, it becomes difficult to separate your authentic self from the performance expected by society. And in many ways, Macaulay spent decades trying to reclaim that separation. One reason his later life interviews resonated so strongly with audiences was because they finally revealed flashes of authenticity untouched by Hollywood packaging. He appeared more comfortable discussing mistakes, more honest about emotional complexity, less interested in pretending fame had been magical. There was wisdom in his exhaustion. At times, he even seemed strangely detached from celebrity culture altogether, almost like someone who had seen behind the curtain too early in life and no longer believed the illusion. That perspective probably saved him, because many former child stars remain trapped chasing the approval they received in youth. They spend adulthood trying to recreate lost fame, hoping public attention will heal emotional emptiness. Macaulay eventually stopped chasing it, and ironically, that may have been the moment he truly began healing. Instead of rebuilding the superstar image Hollywood once sold, he created a quieter life centered around personal stability. Friends described him as protective of his peace, more selective, more grounded. He no longer seemed desperate for public validation. For someone whose childhood depended entirely on pleasing audiences, that emotional independence represented enormous growth. And perhaps fans connected to that growth because they had grown older too. The children who watched Home Alone in the early 1990s became adults themselves. Many began reevaluating the celebrity culture they once consumed so casually. They started recognizing how cruel the entertainment industry could be toward vulnerable young performers. Suddenly, Macaulay's story no longer felt like gossip. It felt tragic, especially when people considered how young he really was during the height of his fame. 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old. Most children at that age are worried about homework, friendships, or birthday parties. Macaulay was carrying studio expectations, financial pressure, global fame, and family instability simultaneously. No child is emotionally prepared for that reality. And yet the world expected him to smile through it constantly. That expectation is what makes certain old interviews almost painful to watch now. Adults around him often treated him less like a child and more like a tiny professional celebrity trained to entertain. Reporters asked invasive questions. Talk show hosts pushed him to perform charm on command. Entire rooms of adults depended financially on his continued success. Looking back, it feels deeply unfair, because beneath the famous face was still just a boy likely terrified more often than people realized, a boy who never truly experienced anonymity, a boy who learned very early that love from the public could disappear overnight. And perhaps that is why his eventual peace feels so powerful emotionally. Not because he returned to dominate Hollywood again, but because he escaped. He escaped the identity that nearly consumed him. He escaped the pressure that haunted his youth. He escaped the cycle that destroys so many child stars permanently. Today, when people see Macaulay Culkin smiling beside Brenda Song and their children, there is something quietly moving about it. The image represents more than happiness. It represents survival. The little boy once swallowed by global fame somehow found his way back to himself. But even now, one heartbreaking thought still lingers over his entire story. The world spent decades loving the character, while the child behind him was desperately trying not to disappear. And maybe that is the part that hurts the most. Because when people revisit the life of Macaulay Culkin now, they are not just looking at a former child star anymore. They are looking at a child who became a global product before he even understood what fame truly meant. Every smile generated profit. Every interview generated ratings. Every movie generated millions. But nobody could measure the emotional damage building quietly underneath all of it. There's something deeply unsettling about how normalized child fame became during the late 20th century. Audiences saw talented children entertaining them and assumed success naturally justified the pressure. Rarely did people ask whether constant exposure, public scrutiny, and financial responsibility were psychologically healthy for developing minds. Macaulay's life forced many people to confront those questions for the first time. Because unlike fictional tragedies written for movies, his pain unfolded in public over decades. The little boy audiences celebrated eventually became a young man hiding from cameras. And that transformation didn't happen accidentally. It happened gradually through emotional exhaustion, family instability, media cruelty, and years of carrying expectations no child could realistically survive untouched. Some fans who watched him closely over the years described a sadness in his eyes that never fully disappeared. Even during happier periods, there were moments when traces of old pain still surfaced unexpectedly, reminders that childhood trauma doesn't simply vanish because life improves later. Healing is not erasing. Healing is learning how to continue living despite the scars. And in many ways, Macaulay became a symbol of that survival. One particularly heartbreaking aspect of his story is how many adults failed him simultaneously. Hollywood executives wanted profits. Tabloids wanted headlines. Audiences wanted entertainment. Family conflicts reportedly revolved around money and control. Meanwhile, the child at the center of everything kept working, kept smiling, kept performing. It raises a difficult moral question society still struggles with today. How much pressure should children ever be allowed to carry for adult industries? Because the emotional consequences can last a lifetime. Former child actors often speak about growing up emotionally disconnected from ordinary experiences. Many never learned basic social boundaries because fame distorted every interaction. Others describe intense loneliness despite constant public attention. Macaulay appeared to experience both. Millions recognized him, yet genuine emotional safety seemed incredibly rare in his life for many years. That contradiction explains why his eventual withdrawal from Hollywood became so important psychologically. To outsiders, it looked like career abandonment. To him, it may have been the first real attempt at self-preservation. He stopped feeding the machine. And once he did, the machine turned cold almost immediately. That is another painful reality of celebrity culture. Fame often creates the illusion of unconditional love, but much of that affection depends on continued visibility and profitability. When stars disappear, many people move on quickly. For a child raised inside that system, the emotional confusion can be devastating. Imagine growing up believing public approval equals personal worth. Then imagine losing it. Many people never emotionally recover from that collapse. But somehow, over time, Macaulay found a way to rebuild himself without depending on Hollywood's validation anymore. That journey deserves more respect than it often receives. Because true recovery from childhood exploitation is incredibly difficult. Trauma experienced during formative years shapes identity deeply. Trust becomes complicated. Self-worth becomes unstable. Relationships become harder to navigate. Yet despite all those obstacles, Macaulay eventually created something many believed impossible for him. A peaceful adult life. Not perfect, not untouched by pain, but real. And perhaps authenticity was what he had been searching for all along. Fans noticed that his later appearances felt different from traditional celebrity performances. He no longer seemed desperate to maintain an image. He spoke more naturally. He laughed more freely. There was less tension in him, less visible emotional armor protecting against public judgment. That transformation resonated because audiences had spent years watching him look emotionally exhausted. Now, for the first time, he seemed present in his own life instead of trapped inside public memory. There's also something deeply symbolic about the fact that he built happiness away from blockbuster fame. Society often teaches celebrities that success means remaining constantly visible. Bigger movies, bigger headlines, bigger attention. Macaulay chose something else. Privacy, stability, family, peace. After everything he endured, those things likely mattered far more than fame ever could again. And maybe fatherhood changed him more profoundly than the public realizes. People who survive painful childhoods often become intensely aware of what children need emotionally. Safety, patience, protection, stability, love without conditions. Perhaps raising his own children gave Macaulay an opportunity to heal parts of himself that fame had damaged decades earlier. That possibility feels emotionally powerful because it represents a complete reversal of his own experience. As a child, he carried adult pressure. As a father, he appears determined to shield his children from it. That is not just healing. That is transformation. Still, no matter how peaceful his life becomes now, the sadness surrounding his story will probably always remain connected to one unavoidable truth. The world watched a child slowly lose his childhood in exchange for entertainment. And for years, most people didn't even realize it was happening. Today, when audiences rewatch Home Alone during the holidays, many feel something unexpected underneath the nostalgia. Alongside the laughter is a quiet ache, a realization that the cheerful little boy on screen was carrying invisible burdens while the world applauded. The performance still feels magical, but now it also feels fragile, because audiences finally understand something they missed back then. Behind the iconic smile was a child trying desperately to survive a world that needed him to keep performing no matter how much it hurt. And somehow, against all odds, Macaulay Culkin survived long enough to finally become more than the character the world refused to let go.